The thesis of this paper, which is on the ministry of C.H. Spurgeon and the Metropolitan Tabernacle to the poor of London, the thesis is that the ministries of the Metropolitan Tabernacle during the pastorate of Charles Haddon Spurgeon contributed more to the evangelistic success often attributed to Spurgeon's preaching alone than is frequently recognized. Now, at the outset, I should acknowledge that I first began to have a real interest in studying this subject on and off for a long time, but particularly about 2 years ago at this time. And so I began to gather some sources, to talk to people about did they know of other sources, and beginning to gather information. And I was at the Southern Baptist Convention, June of 21, and I mentioned it might have been to Ray Rhodes. I know I always talk to Ray at the convention. It might have been someone else. And I said, I found nothing out there on this subject. And he said, well, did you know that there's a dissertation on this very subject that's about to be finished? And my heart sank in one sense. I knew it'd be a great boon in terms of my own research, but in terms of coming up with something original, that was completely dashed. Now, the worst case situation is when you're supervising a doctoral student and they're already into their project. They've written chapters, only to find out someone else is way ahead of you in the process. They're going to finish first, and therefore you have to start from scratch. We expected to have someone here today who was one of my PhD supervisees, Dr. Brian Albert, who did his on Spurgeon. And Brian was significantly into his dissertation when he found out someone else was finishing on the same project, and he had to start from scratch on a PhD dissertation. So, anyway, fortunately, it wasn't to that level for me, but I heard about a dissertation on an eagerness to be up and doing, the evangelical activism of Charles Haddon Spurgeon by none other than Alex J. DePrima. And his book out there is the published dissertation. So basically, I have a commercial. It's a 40-minute commercial for get his book. And I'm also acknowledging that a lot of what I put in here eventually came. He was kind enough to share his dissertation with me before it was published. And we got to know one another through a distance that way. So I want to give credit to where credit is due, and you'll hear his name a couple of times. I've divided this paper, which there's no more ideal situation to be in than reading an academic paper immediately after lunch. If you need to, stand up, walk around in the back, or follow the photographer around, just something to kind of stay awake. But I've divided this into three parts: the man, the ministries, and the meaning. The man, the ministries, and the meaning. So first of all, the man, Charles Haddon Spurgeon. I think at some point we do have to give some biographical information here that's acknowledging the fact that while many of you in this room could do a better job than I'm about to do in a few minutes here about brief biography of Spurgeon, but we acknowledge that in an academic setting, there are people who really don't know. There are people here today who wouldn't know as much about his biography as perhaps most in the room would. But I think our responsibility is to give some sort of biography to Spurgeon. Don't want to assume that everyone knows what we're talking about here. So, the man who would become known around the world as the Prince of Preachers was born in Kelvedon, Essex on June 19th, 1834. His father and grandfather were congregational pastors, and many of his earliest years were spent living with his grandparents. And some of these things are going to be repetitious from what we heard in Dr. DePrima's paper earlier. Thus, Charles Spurgeon began his life with at least some familiarity with meager means because of the circumstances that have been already laid out of his father's being in debtor prison, the financial situation that resulted for the family. And that's, I think, I'm foreshadowing here that for most of his life, his early life especially, Spurgeon understood what it meant to be poor. He was the constant companion of his grandfather, both in his ministerial duties and in his study. And he absorbed there not only his grandfather's pastoral example, but also his books. And Spurgeon became precociously fascinated with his grandfather's library, and particularly books such as Pilgrim's Progress, which by late in life he would claim to have read 100 times. That's once a year. At least once a year, his entire adult life, in addition to the 5 books a week that he read. And if I'm not mistaken, one of those copies, a curved edition, is in this room. Back there, I believe that perhaps somewhere on his pockets somewhere, this brother, who was known to be a man who had no angles about him, right? Carried that, and this curved edition of a pocket-sized Pilgrim's Progress is back there in this very room. And also, John Fox's Book of Martyrs. And soon, though he was but a young boy, he immersed himself in a wide variety of Puritan theological and expository writings. Now, despite the exemplary family piety in which he was raised and the exceptional knowledge of the Bible and theology he exhibited from childhood onward, Spurgeon knew himself. He knew himself to be unconverted. An awareness of his sinful heart seized him in his early teens and tortured him with a growing hopelessness of any escape from the inevitable judgment of God. It wasn't until that snowy Sunday morning, mid-January 1850, when he was 15, that he found forgiveness of his sin and freedom from the bondage that had held him. He was on his way to another church. The severity of the storm that mid-January caused him to seek shelter in a primitive Methodist chapel. And the snow had prevented both the pastor and all but a handful of other worshipers at this church from attending. And an unprepared layman finally rose to preach, choosing as his text Isaiah 45:22, "Look unto me and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is none else." And during the sermon, even though the preacher pointed directly at the teenager and noted how miserable he appeared, the young Spurgeon looked to Christ in faith and was converted by means of the simplest presentation of the gospel imaginable. After 3 months of study of the biblical teaching on baptism, he broke with family tradition and was immersed at Ilam Ferry on the River Lark on May 3rd, 1850. And became a member of a Baptist church. Later, his mother wrote, Charles, I often prayed to the Lord to make you a Christian, and we've heard the great story of that. But I never asked that you might become a Baptist. Replying with the wit that would characterize him all his life, he replied, Mother, the Lord has answered your prayer with his usual bounty and given exceedingly abundantly above all that you ask or thought. Almost immediately, he moved to Cambridge and began teaching Sunday school at St. Andrew's Baptist Church. In the winter that followed, he was basically tricked into a situation when, while walking to an outlying cottage for a small gathering of believers, he learned he was expected to preach. The people were so impressed with his sermon that before long, he was in demand as a lay preacher in similar gatherings in the Cambridge area. On October 12th, 1851, the 16-year-old Spurgeon was invited to preach at a small village church in Waterbeach, about 5 miles from Cambridge. He was asked to preach the following 2 Sundays and ended up as the teenage pastor for 2 years. He preached to 12 people on his first Sunday. But the church grew to about 400 in attendance during his brief pastorate. He was never paid more than a pittance, and his congregation was essentially a collection of poor country folk. Thus, his ministry began in a context where both he and his people had to work very hard just to provide the basic necessities of life. Word of Spurgeon's remarkable preaching spread, and he received an invitation to fill the pulpit of New Park Street Chapel in London on December 18th, 1851. New Park Street an historic congregation once pastored by Baptist heroes such as Benjamin Keach, John Gill, and John Rippon, who collectively served the same church for 150 years, these three pastors, was then in decline. The young country pastor felt lonely and very out of place when his train arrived in the largest city in the world. Before Spurgeon even saw the church building, he was overwhelmed by the poverty and vice he saw everywhere. But his preaching the next morning astonished the small congregation, and attendance surged for the evening service. By April 28th, 1854, Charles Spurgeon was their pastor, and there he would remain until his death on the last day of January, 1892. Under Spurgeon's preaching, New Park Street Chapel grew rapidly, and in 1861, it changed its name to the Metropolitan Tabernacle when it relocated to a large new building at the intersection of Elephant and Castle in a poor part of South London. During construction of the building, the church met for a time at Exeter Hall, and 5,000 people attended each service. On October 7th, 1857, just 3.5 years since his arrival in London, the 23-year-old Spurgeon was asked to preach at the great Crystal Palace on a national day of humiliation and prayer, and 23,564 came to hear him. 23 years old. So it is no surprise that from the first Sunday in the new building, thousands who wanted to hear Spurgeon had to be turned away. So they built a brand new building, and the very first Sunday, they're turning away thousands of people every Sunday. The 6,000-seat facility was filled in both the morning and evening services each week for the next 30 years. Members had to obtain a free ticket in order to be assured a seat, provided they arrived before the time when the doors were open to all others. Once the official membership of the church reached 6,000, making the Metropolitan Tabernacle the largest evangelical church in the world, it became almost impossible for non-members to attend. 6,000 active members, 6,000 seats. On occasion, Spurgeon would ask the members to remain home the following Sunday. Imagine that. Telling your people, please don't come to church next Sunday, so that the unconverted might hear the gospel. But once this became known, the numbers of those seeking admission the next week would be greater than on a regular Sunday. For nearly all of 1867, the church met at Agricultural Hall while the Metropolitan Tabernacle was being renovated, and 20,000 attended every service. The rest of Spurgeon's life and ministry was equally remarkable and unprecedented. By the beginning of 1855, demand for his sermons resulted in an 8-page printing of them known as the Penny Pulpit, which would appear on the streets on the Thursday following the preaching of the sermons. Circulation of these went international, and eventually as many as 25,000 per week were sold. His famous 1862 sermon on baptismal regeneration, in which he challenged the teaching of the Church of England, sold 350,000 copies. These were collected into annual volumes known as the New Park Street Pulpit for 6 years, and later the Metropolitan Tabernacle Pulpit, which is sometimes the name collectively given to the entire set. New volumes containing sermons preached beyond the regular Sunday morning and evening schedule, for at one point he preached as many as 10 times per week, appeared annually for 25 years after his death. 25 years after his death, annual volumes of the same size came forth. Publication ceased in 1917 only because of the paper shortage in England due to World War I. The 63-volume set, and incidentally, the Banner of Truth collected some sermons and added them. Sometimes you may think of it as a 64-volume set, comprises perhaps the largest set of works by any Christian author in English. I mean, some say the largest collection of works by any single author in English. And now I know there's 75 volumes of Edwards, but only 26 are in print. These are all in print. And then we have the 12 additional volumes of the Water Beach sermons. And what's the name of that set called?
Lost Sermons.
The Lost Sermons that B&H Academic is putting out. But that term, the set, the MTP, 63 volumes, the largest collection of works reported by any single author in the world in English. And that continues to be sold in digital format with places like Logos. All of it's available, I believe, at Spurgeon.org, all the volumes, and they're searchable there as well. But if you ever find a print edition, they don't sell them. I'm not sure they print them at all anymore. I know it's been forever since they sold them as a set. If you ever find a hard copy set, whether you sell your firstborn child, whatever, buy that, no matter what the cost, because you don't see them very often. And as a part of the history of this institution, when this institution became a more conservative school, the professor of preaching that resigned in anticipation of what a new president had been approved became official in June of 1995. And the preaching professor resigned at that point, went to another school, seeing the handwriting on the wall, and sold his entire set of the Metropolitan Tabernacle pulpit. Preaching professor sold it for $100. Which, in my opinion, thereby disqualifies anyone from teaching preaching, if they will do that. And with the comment that Spurgeon was no model to follow in preaching. Well, but if you ever do find a complete set, buy it. Though to be able to search digitally, nothing can replace that either. So get both. So in addition to this enormous set, though, Spurgeon authored some 120 other books, or an average of one new book every 4 months. Okay, so think about that. The largest collection of books by any single author in the world in English, okay? 63 volumes. The largest collection of books. Oh, in addition, he wrote 120 other books. Every 4 months, a new book comes out with all this that's going on. And then I'll tell my students, and you have trouble writing a 20-page journal, and you got a whole semester. I mean, I read that and I think, what have you guys done the last 4 months, Compared to my last 4 months, I look at what Spurgeon did and I think, well, I made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's kind of in comparison what I've done in the last 4 months. Well, the best known of these other books are his more likely 7-volume commentary on the Psalms, The Treasury of David. In 1865, he acquired even more ink to publish a monthly magazine, The Sword and the Trowel, to which he contributed articles and book reviews for each issue for the next 25 years or so. As we shall soon see, Spurgeon presided over more than 66 different ministry organizations. The first and most precious to him was the Pastor's College he founded in 1859. And here Spurgeon lectured every Friday afternoon, compiling some of these in another of his best-selling books and still printed lectures to my students. Because his became the most recognized name in the Christian world, because he had former students writing to him for advice, and because he had more than 66 ministries to lead, and never once in his whole life did he ever go, hello? And he had the largest evangelical church in the world, a pastor. He constantly was buried in correspondence. How do you lead 66 organizations? How do you pastor the largest evangelical church in the world? How do you do all these things if there's no telephone and the only way to communicate is with a dip pen? He did try a fountain pen for a while. They'd just been invented. L.E. Waterman, as you know, patented the first fountain pen in 1888. Spurgeon tried it, didn't like it. I probably wouldn't have either. It's a little messy, so he liked dip pen in which he would dip it into his favorite violet-colored ink. I have a couple of the manuscripts of his galleys. I'm sure you have many of them here that he wrote, made notes for Metropolitan Tabernacle pulpit. And I always thought that it was black ink that was faded, but it's violet. His favorite ink was violet color, and he would dip and write. And as a result, he was buried in correspondence. And he reflects some of the pressure of this when he wrote, "No one living knows the toil and care I have to bear." And after a paragraph in which he lists some of his many responsibilities, and just before the sentence, "This, however, is only half my duty," he says that he has an average, now get this, a weekly average of 500 letters to be answered. 500 letters with a dip pen. I calculated once that at 1 minute per letter, that's an 8.5-hour day without going to the bathroom, without eating. And we have thousands of these letters, 50 just announced. How many of those, just off the top of your head, you estimate could not have been written in 1 minute? A large percentage of them, right? But at 1 minute each, that's an 8.5-hour day. 500 letters a week. This is well documented. In addition to the 5 books he read every week, the magazine that he edited and wrote articles for, the book he writes every 4 months, pastoring the largest evangelical church in the world, presiding over 66 organizations. Yeah, Spurgeon was Superman. God was just on him. Like Handel writing the Messiah in a month. How is this even possible? Of course, he dies at 57. But if I lived to be 257, I couldn't do this. And he says this is only half my duty. And Arnold Allamore insists that these letters were not dictated to a secretary, but were the product of his own hand. Guys, I don't think I could type 500 tweets a week. If I was just copying verses out of the Bible, he is composing these individually. Now, I'd love to talk with you guys at some point about the dictation idea. I made a quotation earlier today which said he would dictate to secretaries. Dallimore says he didn't, but we've got thousands of letters, and Spurgeon says that, it was overwhelming. At only 1 minute per letter, as I said, this is an 8.5-hour day. He performed some of the funerals and weddings of church members. And in his private life, Spurgeon claims to have read 5 books a week. I mentioned that. His wife, Susanna, church member there, whom he married on January 8th, 1856, reported that regardless of how busy her husband was, and I mentioned this morning, at 6 o'clock each evening, he led her, their twin sons, Thomas and Charles, and all visitors to the home at the time in family worship. Tell me you're busier than Charles Spurgeon. Tell me you're too busy to have family worship. Well, tell me you're busier than Charles Spurgeon. No one with a scale of life the size of Spurgeon's can live without controversy. He was criticized and pilloried in the newspapers for his youth and preaching style from his first month in London. The second year, he preached to 12,000 people at the Surrey Gardens Music Hall, but an apparently coordinated group of people began shouting fire, and 7 people were crushed to death. The shock and the public attacks from this haunted him the rest of his life. But the most debilitating was the downgrade controversy in 1887 and 88. His charges of liberalism in the Baptist Union, made through the sword and the trowel, were met with virulent opposition from many within the ranks of the Union. Spurgeon and the Metropolitan Tabernacle withdrew from the Baptist Union, and in the Union's annual convention, Spurgeon was censured by an almost unanimous vote, including many of his former students whose education he had provided and he had underwritten. Many, including both Charles and Susanna, would write that these events were so stressful, that they shortened his life. In light of all he accomplished and all that he endured, it's little wonder that Spurgeon would struggle with depression and ill health for most of his adult life and die at age 57. But the question before us in this time together is how much of Spurgeon's unprecedented success, especially among the poor, is attributable solely to his incomparable preaching. For when the name Charles Haddon Spurgeon is mentioned, is there anyone who does not think first of him as a preacher? Indeed, to this day, he's still widely known as the Prince of Preachers. Did the thousands who were converted under his ministry come to faith in Christ solely because they had heard of Spurgeon's reputation in the pulpit, came to the Metropolitan Tabernacle on their own initiative, managed to find a seat, heard the gospel, and were saved? I want to present the thesis that the ministries of the Metropolitan Tabernacle of London during the pastorate of Charles Haddon Spurgeon contributed more to the evangelistic success often attributed to Spurgeon's preaching alone than is frequently recognized. So that's the man. Second now, the ministries of Spurgeon and the Metropolitan Tabernacle to the poor. I want to contend first that Spurgeon's example and vision for ministry to the poor was both a compass and engine for the church's ministry to the poor. Again, subpoint under point 2 there. Spurgeon's example and vision for ministry to the poor was both a compass and engine for the church's ministry to the poor. Spurgeon's early life and first pastorate, as we have seen, made him no stranger to poverty. Although he always had food, clothing, and a roof over his head, he rarely had much more than that for the first 20 years of his life. Being familiar from early childhood with the ministerial rounds of his grandfather and father, growing up in churches where the needs of members and the community were often known, and pastoring in a rural church had exposed him to the realities and prevalence of poverty. As soon as he came to London, impressed by the deprivation from the windows of the train that brought him there, his knowledge of the despair of the poor became firsthand. The city had endured waves of cholera epidemics since 1849, but one of the worst outbreaks occurred in August of 1854, less than 4 months after Spurgeon officially became pastor of New Park Street Chapel. Signs with a single word, cholera, were posted in windows throughout the vicinity of the church, warning people where the disease was known to have spread. Cholera is highly contagious, but the means by which it is spread were just beginning to be discovered at the end of this very wave in 1854. It was widely believed to be contracted via bad air, either from London's notorious air pollution at the time, which was at its worst in the poorer parts of London, or from the houses and rooms of the stricken in particular. For this reason, many ministers fled to the country when cholera struck. Spurgeon, by contrast, determined that a pastor was especially needed at such a time. In his autobiography, he describes the demands of those days and the toll it took on him. Family after family summoned me to the bedside of the smitten, and almost every day I was called to visit the grave. At first, I got myself up with youthful ardor to the visitation of the sick, and was sent for from all corners of the district by persons of all ranks and religions. But soon I was weary in body and sick at heart. My friends seemed falling one by one, and I felt or fancied that I was sickening like those around me. In other words, he thought he was getting cholera. Spurgeon's willingness to minister to the dying poor became so well known that even his enemies recognized it. Once at 3 a.m., the bell at his door rang, and he was asked to come to the bedside of a dying man he did not know. When he arrived, the woman attending him said that he had called for Spurgeon not 30 minutes before, but he was now unconscious. Although Spurgeon attempted to share the gospel with the man, there was no response, and he died with Spurgeon still in the room. The woman told him what Spurgeon later reported. That man, in his lifetime, had been wont to jeer at me in strong language. He had often denounced me as a hypocrite. Yet he was no sooner smitten by the darts of death than he sought my presence and counsel. No doubt, feeling in his heart that I was a servant of God, though he did not care to own it with his lips. Spurgeon would relate these sorts of episodes not in a way as to be the hero of his own illustrations, but as a means of encouraging his hearers to follow his example as an expression of their love for Christ. What is it? He asked his congregation in a sermon just a few months later, February 1855, that empowers yonder minister in the midst of the cholera to climb up that creaking staircase and stand by the bed of some dying creature who has that dire disease. It must be a thing of power which leads him to risk his life. It is love of the cross of Christ which leads him to do it. Another expression of Spurgeon's example and vision for ministry, my argument is the church's ministry to the poor was driven by his example, in large part, his vision. Another illustration of this is seen in his concern for the countless orphans of London. In 1855, he traveled to Bristol to meet George Mueller and see his famous orphanage. In tears much of the time there, Spurgeon resolved to do something one day for the fatherless of London. The opportunity came 11 years later, and to put this in a little bit of context, by the way, because I have my students read the biography of George Mueller. He's already referred to him as Mueller's famous orphanage. This is 1855. In the 1830s, later 1830s, I think, when George Mueller founded his first orphanage, there were more orphans in England when Mueller started his orphanage than there were more children under age 7 in prison than in orphanages in England. Because A, there were very few orphanages at the time. And B, there were lots of orphans for a lot of reasons I won't get into. And so if you were an orphan during those times, you came home, you're 6 years old, and you knock on the door and no one answers. And you try to push it open, nothing happens. And finally someone yells out, they're dead, kid. Or they left, kid. And this mystified child knows not what to do, and maybe they just sink down in the doorway, and all they have to their name is on their back, and there's not much of that, and they have nowhere to go. And they sleep in the doorway perhaps, and they get hungry that night, and they wake up the next morning, and they're even hungrier. And it doesn't take very long of that before what do they start doing? They start stealing. And then they realize it's more advantageous to begin to band together with other kids in the same situation. And they start stealing with them. And before long, you are Oliver Twist, which was written about the same time, describing the plight of orphans throughout England. And so this band of orphans would bound upon some woman coming from the market and take her food and money and everything she has. And people demanded something's got to be done. And so the police would round them up, and there was no other place to put them but in prison. And so orphanages began to spring up, and George Mueller was one of the first to do this in the 1830s. This is only 1855. There's still a lot of this prevalent. And so Spurgeon goes to visit Mueller's orphanages, and he's in tears, he said, much of the day. And incidentally, he would support Mueller financially. Mueller was invited to preach at least once, I think, at Metropolitan Tabernacle. And he remained a fan of Mueller's for the rest of his life. It's very fascinating to read the differences, though. I'll say a word about them. Spurgeon said, I'm going to do something for orphans one day, the fatherless of London. And the opportunity came 11 years later, where you heard this morning, when Mrs. Hilliard, the widow of an Anglican vicar, and a woman totally unknown to Spurgeon, read one of his articles in The Sword and the Trowel and sent an unexpected gift of £20,000 in 2021 dollars, that's $2.3 million, to be used at Spurgeon's discretion. Now imagine that. Somebody you don't know sends you $2.3 million because of one thing they've read of yours you've written, and they say use it however you want. So he led the church to use the gift to build a Stockwell orphanage for boys in 1867. Applicants were to be from ages 6 to 10, and unlike Mueller, the home accepted orphans from all religious backgrounds and all races, making it one of the first in England to do so. And unlike Mueller, who received only orphans who had lost both parents, Spurgeon frequently admitted children whose fathers had died and whose mothers had more children than they could feed, seeing this as a way to care for widows as well as orphans. Because there were widows who had enough children, they would have to abandon one or abandon two or just say, you can't come home anymore. And Spurgeon thought these children needed care as well. By the middle of 1868, 240 boys lived there. In 1879, Spurgeon led the Metropolitan Tabernacle to build a Stockwell orphanage for girls. And between the two institutions, about 500 children were cared for at any given time. In the 25 years between the establishment of the first orphanage and Spurgeon's death, more than 1,500 children had been received, and the orphanage was not underwritten by the church, but was financed by private donations. Spurgeon often paid for many of the bills out of his own pocket. More than 150 years after its founding, the Stockwell Orphanage still continues under the name, as we heard this morning, of Spurgeon's Children's Charity. And according to its website, today the charity has contact with over 30,000 children and adults, whilst working more intensively with over 3,000 children and young people. If the pastor's college held first place in Spurgeon's heart among the ministries of the tabernacle, the orphanages were a close second. He loved to visit them. He would call upon children when needed and spent each Christmas day among the orphans. An American named John Gow once visited Spurgeon and asked the pastor to take him to the orphanage. While they were there, Spurgeon was called to the side of a dying orphan. And Dr. DePrima quotes Gow recollecting the scene. I've seen Mr. Spurgeon holding by his power 6,500 persons in a breathless interest. I knew him as a great man, universally esteemed and beloved. But as he sat by the bedside of a dying pauper child, whom his beneficence had rescued, he was to me a greater and grander man than when swaying the mighty multitudes at his will. This is the Prince of Preachers, who is also a father to the fatherless and an example to his flock. Though many more could be cited, a third prominent testimony to Spurgeon's example and vision for ministry to the poor can be seen in the almshouses built under his influence for widows who were members of his church. When the church relocated to the Metropolitan Tabernacle, they attempted to maintain a daughter church at the New Park Street Chapel. Despite their best efforts, they found it impossible to keep people from eventually gravitating to the nearby tabernacle. I mean, come on, after you've been used to Spurgeon preaching, I don't care, you're going to make the trip. I don't care what is left behind there. So the building was sold. And in 1867, the money was used to construct a small village of 17 row houses near the Elephant and Castle train station. Widows over age 60 could apply and were chosen on the basis of greatest need. A small weekly pension was provided for each of them, and they could live there without cost until their death. Soon, a school was built at the end of the almshouses for poor children of the neighborhood, and it provided 400 children at a time with a free education. As a 24/7 operation, with the addition of pensions provided for the widows and the cost of running a large school, the almshouses proved to be an enormously expensive endeavor. As with the orphanage, for years, Spurgeon designated a large portion of the income of his books to provide for the needs of the almshouses. He was also known to devote special gifts meant for him previously to the expenses of the almshouses. Dr. DePrima reports that in 1879, on the occasion of Spurgeon's silver wedding anniversary, the tabernacle, the congregation presented Spurgeon with a gift of 6,233 pounds, more than $810,000 in 2021 dollars. I don't know if your church has acknowledged your wedding anniversary to the tune of $810,000 of gifts there. But 5,000 pounds of that, in other words, 5/6 of it, Spurgeon immediately gave as an endowment for the almshouses, with the balance going to some of Spurgeon's other benevolent ministries. So not only was Spurgeon generous to the poor, when the Lord prospered him, his church often saw how he used his own prosperity to bless those in need. So he had the vision. He was the example to the flock. So building upon the assertion that Spurgeon's example and vision for ministry to the poor was both the compass and the engine for the church's ministry to the poor, I also want to maintain, this is sub-point 2, under point 2. Inspired by Spurgeon's example and vision, the members of the Metropolitan Tabernacle led many people to Christ before these people heard Spurgeon preach, and brought many of the people to church who were subsequently converted under Spurgeon's preaching. So the ministries of the church led many people to Christ and then brought them to hear preaching, or they brought them to hear Spurgeon. They didn't just wander in because of the fame of Spurgeon. They were brought to church as a result of the ministries of the church. So it's one thing to visit the sick in a time of cholera, but one man cannot visit all the sick and dying in such a densely populated area as it was around the Metropolitan Tabernacle, even in normal times. Spurgeon built orphanages, almshouses, and schools for poor children, but he could not provide the meals and the daily care needed by the orphans and the widows, nor run a school and teach the children every day, nor maintain all these buildings. Where would the dozens, if not hundreds, of staff and volunteers needed for all these ministries, where would they come from? But these benevolent ministries barely scratched the surface of those Spurgeon led. In 1884, a Jubilee celebration was held at the Tabernacle for the pastor's 50th birthday. The event required 2 consecutive evenings in order to accommodate the speeches. It takes 2 whole nights to make the presentations people had, from leaders of the church as well as guests like D.L. Moody and Joseph Parker. The presentations, the greetings from people around the world, and Spurgeon's responses to all these things. At one point, J.W. Harrell, that was the name I was trying to think of this morning, Spurgeon's secretary, read an astonishing list of 66 different ministries that operated out of the church and over which Spurgeon presided. Before the list was read, it was acknowledged that there were others. These were merely the ones who had representatives present on these 2 nights. For example, one that was omitted was the Blind Society, established for the evangelization specifically of the blind among the poor. I'll not present the entire list, but I'll mention a few that are representatives of the whole. The almshouses, the pastor's college, the Stockwell Orphanage, the Coal Portage Association, that was the literature ministry, Mrs. Spurgeon's Book Fund, the Pastor's Aid Fund, the Ladies' Benevolent Society, the Poor Ministers' Clothing Society, the Gospel Temperance Society, the Mission to Foreign Seamen, the Mission to Policemen, the Almshouses Sunday Schools, the Almshouses Day Schools, and dozens of missions, Bible classes for adults and Sunday schools for children that opened in poor neighborhoods near the Tabernacle and across London. Spurgeon's close friend, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, was chairman of the second evening of this Jubilee celebration. He expressed what everyone must have been thinking when he said, "What a powerful administrative mind our friend possesses," is shown by that list which has been read of the various societies and associations constructed by his genius and superintended by his care. There are more than enough to occupy the minds and hearts of some 50 ordinary men. As astounding as it is to think of more than 66 ministries constructed by one man's genius and superintended by his care, the sheer number of them only multiplies the stakes and intensifies the significance of the question, who did the actual work of these ministries? The scope of such work would require literally thousands of people. The answer is supplied by the fact that they were not subsidiaries of an organization named Charles Spurgeon Ministries. Rather, they were all ministries of the Metropolitan Tabernacle. There were some 6,000 members of the church at this time, and a much higher percentage of them were actively involved in the ministries of the church than is common in evangelical churches today. Dallimore insists that, quote, apart from the sick and infirm, there were very few who came only on Sundays. Many of the ministries of the tabernacle, of course, operated out of the church building. Like a giant beehive, the great structure was constantly in use. 7 days a week, the doors opened at 7 a.m., did not close until 11 p.m. After 6,000 people exited following the morning worship service on Sundays, and before another 6,000 gathered in the same building in the evening, various adult Bible classes met there in the afternoon, along with a Sunday school, and 100 teachers instructing 1,000 children from the surrounding area. That's in the afternoons. Other Bible classes met during the week. Weekdays would find ministries such as the Ladies' Benevolent Society sewing clothes for the women in the almshouses, the children in the orphanage, and for the needy of the neighborhood. The members of the Maternal Society would meet to prepare gifts for expectant mothers, then disperse to distribute what they had made and collected flowers. Distribute what they'd made. Flowers would be brought to the meeting of the Flower Society, then arranged into baskets and bouquets and taken to the sick and those in the hospital. Weekdays, the tabernacle often hosted the annual meeting of one of the ministries of the church, such as the Christian Butchers Association, which assembled 1,600 butchers to hear the gospel. Now, somebody's got to cook the food and do all the other logistical work for 1,600 people meeting. And this was going on all the time. With 66 plus ministries and organizations, it seems that one of them had its annual banquet every week of the year. And so Charles is heading out Tuesday night. No, Tuesday night's when they interviewed prospective church members, right? But Thursday night, let's say, he's heading out, and Susie says, where are you going, Charles? The annual banquet of the boys' orphanage. Next Thursday night, where are you going? The annual banquet of the girls' orphanage. Next Thursday, where are you going? The annual banquet of the pastor's college. Every week of the year is the annual banquet of something. And who did they want to hear speak? The governor, you know. They wanted to hear the president of the organization speak. So organizations from outside the tabernacle also, such as the Bible Society, the Baptist Union, and various missionary societies often held their meetings at the church. And as you consider the coordination of these daily events at the tabernacle, remember that many of these gatherings involve food. Sometimes 3 entire meals occurred with groups meeting early in the morning, midday, and in the evening. When you reflect on the preparation, the serving of the food, then the cleanup and washing of the dishes afterward, the logistical challenges of doing that maybe 3 times in a day, the daily operation of the Metropolitan Tabernacle is just staggering. Added to all this is the daily cleaning and ongoing maintenance of a building that was used 16 hours a day, 7 days a week by thousands of people. 12,000 every Lord's Day. Just morning and evening service. Clearly, an army of staff and volunteers was required to make all this happen. No one knows how many would have been paid, but obviously the percentage was very small. Yes, 6,000 people heard Spurgeon when he preached at the tabernacle, but Dallimore's assertion now seems almost a humorous understatement. There were very few who came only on Sundays. My emphasis here is not just that the vast majority of Spurgeon's congregation followed his example and responded to his preaching regarding ministry of the poor, but also that many of this army of staff of volunteers was an army of evangelists whose witness contributed significantly to the conversion growth of this tabernacle. And I just realized that I'm way over. This is where I can summarize Lavinia Bartlett's story, the woman, number 4 in the list, Dr. Freeman. She was responsible for between 900 and 1,000. Let's see, who made this statement? This is in his autobiography. 900 to 1,000 members of her class joined the church. So she went out and got them as Sunday school members. Then they joined the church. So we're talking about 6,000 people in the church. She contributed 1,000 of those. Well, what's the meaning of this? This is point 3. 3A, one measure of Christian preaching is the degree to which it produces real Christians. I mean, most of us don't have the opportunities to preach to as many lost people as Spurgeon did. But nevertheless, you preach that long, you preach the Bible, real Christians will be produced. And so Spurgeon saw that, and they turned around and began to be evangelists and servants in a way that helped bring people back into the church. So Spurgeon's preaching not only produced Christians, but real Christians in the sense they didn't just sit under his preaching and become just more knowledgeable of the Bible, but more like Christ in that they also went out, shared the gospel, and ministered to others. So and B, Spurgeon's pastoral and leadership abilities may have been as exceptional as his preaching. Think about all of this, and he's pastoring this group. Unparalleled preacher in history, but he must have been an amazing pastor as well, and an organizer and leader to ride herd on all this. Well, my closing paragraph then. Charles Haddon Spurgeon was God's chosen instrument in building the largest evangelical church of its day. Even with the hundreds of deaths during Spurgeon's 38-year pastorate, the dismissal of many by means of biblical church discipline, and the departure of hundreds more commissioned to start new churches, the Metropolitan Tabernacle long sustained an active membership of more than 6,000 people. The great bulk of those who were not Christians who transferred their membership from other churches rather than, wait a minute, let me say that again. The great bulk of these were not Christians who transferred their membership from other churches. Rather, they were people baptized by Spurgeon as new Christians, as new converts. This is Tom Nettles, Living by Revealed Truth. The Holy Spirit's blessing upon Spurgeon's inimitable, biblical, Christ-centered preaching was unquestionably the effectual cause of the conversion of most of those Spurgeon baptized. But as I'm sure Spurgeon himself would urge us, we should never forget the indispensable role played by the thousands known only now to God who brought other thousands outside the walls of the tabernacle to Christ, or brought them to hear Spurgeon preached the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you.